Classified material was found at Donald Trump's house a few months ago, and the media had a field day, if you remember. This past week, classified material was found at Joe Biden's home. They both broke the law, and they both took classified home when they weren't allowed to. Do you think the media is biased against Donald Trump? Does that affect democracy, and what can be done about that?
Well, in one word, yes, to the answer to your first question. I believe that now a second batch has been found at Biden's home.
Oh, the second batch, yeah.
It was the second batch. Okay, you could say, how much is a batch? But, yeah, they're both wrong, very wrong. And due process should take place, I think even Hillary Clinton had a problem because she sent emails from... And British MPs have been accused of sending emails from their own account.
What can be done about this bias? What can be done about the media bias? Nothing overnight. It's very difficult. It's worth noting. Yeah.
Biden does seem to get a free pass, whereas Donald Trump did not. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not Donald Trump's greatest fan. I think he did a tremendous amount of good, particularly in the Middle East.
Oh, I don't like no, true.
With the Abraham Accords and so on. And my son in Florida was, a supporter of him, although he recently met Joe Biden, by the way. I've got a picture.
You showed me the pictures, yeah.
I showed you. But, we accept that's the narrative, that, Trump good, Biden bad. You said, what can be done about it? I mean, not a lot overnight, but, we have to highlight it. And there is right-wing media and press, both in America and here, and they should be calling it out.
What do you think, Nathan?
So I think, regardless of whether the media are individually biased against Donald Trump, and he uses that to his political advantage, which, in terms of trading the swamp and all that sort of language, actually I think there's a broader problem, which is that the media gives Donald Trump too much oxygen, especially for some of his ridiculous comments that tries to present two sides to the argument when generally there isn't. I think that's a bigger problem with Trump. I think he got a lot of press attention. And often he uses the criticism he gets to his political advantage, and that's what he does. But with regards to classified information, I think there's a dichotomy between what Trump did and what Biden did, which is in terms of responding to it, which Trump said is a conspiracy and they're all out to get me, whereas Biden's cooperating with the special counsel who's been appointed to it, and that's the right thing to do. But I think, it suggests...
So there's a massive difference in language as well, and how they respond to situations.
Exactly. And it suggests that, they have different approaches to politics and to democracy.
So based on that they have different approaches to language and how they use criticism to fuel their own movement.
Yeah.
Do you think the media is biased against Donald Trump or not?
I think it's more complicated than that. I think some individual outlets will be biased against Trump, but it's more complicated, it's more nuanced, because a lot of those who do criticise him actually increase his profile and increase his message and convey his message, but also some of those, Fox News isn't biased against him, aren't they? So
but they're openly biased against him. So if you say I am biased towards a side, then it's different.
And the US climate is different. The media-wise, the media, you'll know what the political balance of the company you're watching is.
So what can be done to stop those individual outlets from being biased against him, or being biased anyway?
I think they've got to present. You've got to be reasonable, but there's a lot to be, these sort of biases loaded, but there's lots of things to throw at Donald Trump that he's done wrong. So it's more complicated than being biased. It's actually presenting a narrative of all the litany of disasters he presented over the 4 years as president, culminating in the January the 6th disaster. I think individual journalists might be biased against Trump. Some will be really supportive of him. As I say, look at Fox News, he watched it all day apparently as a president, and it affected what he tweeted and what he did. I think he circumvented some of that by using Twitter as well. But I don't think there was an agenda. I'm not a massive US politics watcher, but that's my understanding.
Do you think, and Nathan makes a really good point about the criticism that first of all, Donald Trump uses criticism to fuel his own campaign, and second of all, the language he uses, like you made was it when this happened? What did Donald Trump call it?
A conspiracy.
Conspiracy, and then Joe Biden says, "Let me go ahead with the process." Do you not think that does that take away the bias and say, well, they've got a reason to do that? And just
let me come back to football, which we discussed right at the beginning. As a Red, I can tell you Sir Alex Ferguson was very good at sort of, what do they call it, circling the wagons and saying, nobody loves us, we don't care. And actually, it won him some trophies. So Donald Trump just sort of taking a leaf out of Sir Alex Ferguson's book, you may not.
What do you mean?
That makes Biden not offended, by the way.
What I mean is...
Not I wouldn't know what this is.
you know that the football world is divided into two types of people. Manchester United fans, and there's everyone else. ABU, anyone but United, right? So whoever United are playing, if you're not a United fan, you're supporting the opposition.
Okay.
Alex Ferguson used that in his team talks to his players and said, particularly, if you're playing...
It's us against everyone else.
It's us against everyone else, and he cultured that, fostered that culture.
See, the issue is when you say that sort of
Donald Trump.
No, but when you say that sort of thing,
doing that,
when you say that sort of thing, one thing is you could be doing it really well, which you could say to Alex Ferguson. I don't know that much about football. The second point is it could either do really well or it could do really badly, and you can make it into sort of cults.
Sure.
So you need to be very careful. I'm sure Nathan might say it's tend one way rather than another.
Can I just say a couple of other things? First of all, I was going to take issue with Nathan. He said that the press shouldn't give the oxygen of publicity to Donald Trump. I mean, Donald Trump is not some minor individual. Donald Trump for 4 years was president of America, most powerful man in the world, whether we liked it or not, right? And you can't just tell the press, ignore the president. And even now,
some of his claims.
Even now, he is a former president of the United States, who, by the way, is entitled to be called president, Mr. President. That's how it works in America. I was actually once in a it was a UJIA dinner where the President Bush, the first President Bush, was there, and he's addressed as Mr. President. You meet him, you call him Mr. President. So he is a former president of the United States. He's Mr. President, and wisely or unwisely, he's just declared his candidature for 2024. So you can't just ignore the guy. And I think it would be irresponsible to ignore the guy. Second thing I want to say, and here's where I actually want to slightly build on what Nathan said rather than criticise him. Nathan said in America, you know where you are with the media, and he's right. With the both, whether it's TV, radio, or printed press, you know where you are. In Britain, the printed press, you know where you are, so you know that the Sun and the Daily Mail are right-wing, although some supporters but at least you know where you are, and you know the Mirror and the Guardian and the Observer are sort of Labour supporters.
And that's read them so intently.
And I have no problem with that. Where I have a problem is with what we call the media, the TV, particularly TV and radio, but particularly TV organisations like the BBC, who by their charter are supposed to be impartial, and other TV channels who they're not.
Do you think the BBC isn't impartial?
Well, I know we could. Nathan's probably going to tell me that it's too right wing, but
I think it's more. I think it's more complicated than that, and just because Rabbi might think it's too left wing, and I think it's too right wing, doesn't mean they're doing it right actually. But I think there's a broader point. The BBC always think they're right about everything, and their coverage reflects that. But it's also too. I think this is right over Brexit. Its coverage was too focused on individuals rather than the systems, and rather than actually policy choices. So it was all the Brexit policy. It's a massively important debate, and the BBC basically covered it between Boris and David Cameron. This is about thousands and millions of people's jobs and opportunities.
Well, as a media outlet, they're doing what most interests people. So by making it,
they shape what interests most. It's chicken and egg.
Yeah,
and I think the BBC have a lot to work on in terms of that. But you look at Robbie Gibb, who's a former director of communications for a Conservative Prime Minister, Theresa May, and he's now on the BBC board. And apparently he goes into editorial meetings and challenges their coverage, saying you're too critical of Brexit. That was revealed a couple of weeks ago in the New Statesman, and not denied by the Culture Secretary. So there's an argument that you might say that individuals who work for the BBC are left wing, but it's actually that the system means that they cover top down individual basis. And actually, it leans towards the establishment and towards thinking.
What do you think specifically about what Arnold said before about Donald Trump? About that, you just can't ignore him.
I'm not saying to ignore him. I'm saying not to give as much oxygen to some of his bizarre
NFT claims, $99.
Yeah, that's not a story. And there's got to be. I'm not saying ignore the guy completely, not at all. He has a right to, as I say, he's a former president. but I think there's a fine line between obsessing over his every move, which I think a lot of US coverage did. Yeah, and still do. So I think there's got to be a more balanced, where treating him like a conventional politician rather than this sort of massive adult baby that he seems to be.
Can I just come back on that? I'm through with Donald Trump, as they would say in America. I just want to come back to the BBC. The BBC's got a charter, some very specific duties of impartiality, etc. That was bound by what they call the Reith Principles. He was the founder of the BBC, and he said the BBC must inform, entertain, educate, and there's one other.
There's three, and that's the three.
Is it just three? So what they were doing with Brexit, as Nathan quite rightly said, they were focusing on the entertainment part. Oh, Boris Johnson, David Cameron. But they were, in my view, failing on the educate part, let alone inform, right? So they've got to be very, very careful. I think looking back, as I do frequently on the Brexit debate, I think the BBC, and not just the BBC, a lot of the media channels, in my view, were very culpable because they did not analyse the arguments properly. After Brexit, the BBC brought in something called fact check. Had they had fact checking during the Brexit debate, I think things might have been a bit different. I actually went down to London, to Wembley Arena, for the final debate on Brexit. It was 2 days before the Brexit vote. There was Boris Johnson on one side, and on the other side was
Sadiq Khan, Ruth Davidson.
Yeah, that's right, correct. Yes,
Nicholas Sturgeon?
No, it wasn't Nicholas Sturgeon. It was Francis O'Grady,
TUC.
the TUC chair, and Boris Johnson had that Labour MP with the German.
Yes, what?
He's the Stewards.
He's the steward.
So what about it?
Right. So I was at that debate, and I think it was David Dimbleby who was moderating it.
What were you saying?
But again, it was, in my view, it wasn't done properly.
What do you mean? It wasn't impartial?
I think people were given a free pass. And
was that done by the BBC?
Yeah.
Okay.
BBC. Yeah, sorry, yeah.
Do you think that the BBC is biased? I presume you think it's biased towards the other side,
I think it's more common. I think it's impartiality is a bit of a red herring. It's about the way they approach news.
Yeah.
So there could be some cases where because they always think they're right, and they present it in quite a top-down way approach, that they could lean towards Labour. I think because the Conservatives are in government and have been for so many years, there'll be evidence where there'll be more substantial evidence where they'll be the same Conservatives. But it's actually about reforming from the top and having, a broader diversity of views on their BBC board. So the chairman is visually seen as a former boss at Goldman Sachs. He's made substantial donations to the Conservative Party. Actually, that should be an independent crossbench peer. Robbie Gibbs on that board. He has an agenda. In terms of he views it as a left-wing blob. So I think the BBC has a lot of work to do. I think the impartiality thing is a bit of a red herring. It's about their approach.
Well, can I just come in on the impartiality? Impartiality, ironically, can actually mean different things to different people.
Sure.
Because let me just give you an example. Supposing the polls are now in favour of Labour, do you say, well, actually, the duties of impartiality require us to give more, heavier weight to Labour's views because they're ahead of the poll? Or do you say because the Conservatives or the current government, with the majority of, I'm not sure what it is now, keeps going down every time the Conservative MP is suspended, or every time we lose a seat? It's probably about 60 odd, I think. Yeah. So do you say, well, because they're the government that got a majority of 60 odd, we should be slightly partial towards them? So what does impartiality mean? Do you give equal airtime? We had this with the vaccines and other things.
Yeah.
Do you give absolutely equal airtime to somebody coming on saying take the vaccine and somebody coming on saying don't take the vaccine? Well, we've got to be impartial. So impartiality is a bit like the offside law that I was talking about.
You're very into football.
I'm into football, particularly when United are winning again. We've had some very lean times, believe me. Anyway, it's like the offside rule.
Yeah.
You can frame it as much as you like, but at the end of the day, you'll never get it right.
What it goes to as well is the difference between impartiality and balance.
Yeah.
So I think that's what you've just got at, is impartiality is saying, Labour and Conservatives should each have a spokesperson on that news to say, hey, what the government's done wrong, here's what it's done right. But in a case like the vaccines, which is a really good example, or some of the economic evidence on, at the time of the Brexit referendum, it's not right to say, here's what one person thinks and here's what another person thinks, when one is backed up by evidence and one is just on vibes and nonsense, or one's backed up by 99% of economists and one's just Gerard Lyons, Trussonomics type.
Okay, brilliant.
Just one final thing if I may.
Yeah, sure.
Actually, at election time, BBC does get it more right. There are very strict rules at election time. We call it in the trade the Purda period, where the media and the press and indeed council officers have to be very, very careful what they say. And there are strict rules. So, for example, political parties are entitled to party political broadcast, and there are very strict rules on how many you're allowed to get, depending on the size of your party.
Yeah.
And again, you can never get it fully right, because somebody will say, well, we've only got one MP, but we got 15% of the vote, so you do get this sort of argument as well. But at least the rules are strict.
Okay, brilliant. Thanks so much for joining us, Nathan and Arnold. Thanks so much for coming in.
Great, thank you.
Thank you very much.